microphone might be live, and I think we might have a few people coming in from across our partner network. So thank you and hello to you over the internet. So my name is Jennifer Croker. I am the director of the CCTS Research Commons. Out of curiosity, before we jump right in, how many of you have heard about Research Commons? That's fantastic. So for those of you who have never heard of CCTS Research Commons, find me afterwards. I'd love to tell you about it. For those of you who just raised your hands, find me afterwards. I'd love to tell you more. So I'm delighted that you are all here tonight. It got a little cold outside, but I'm glad that you came over. I probably would be remiss if I didn't also put a shameless plug that this forum is conducted monthly. It's the first Wednesday of every month, and it really is geared to address questions that are of a special interest to you. So if you have ideas or suggestions on what you want to hear about, please don't hesitate to let us know. So without any further ado, and to build on some of the things that Dr. Kimberly was just discussing, you might have been hearing a little bit of chatter lately. So perhaps at the break room next to your lab, perhaps in the wings at national meetings, you might be hearing words such as rigor or transparency, or perhaps even more commonly, reproducibility. So as you probably know, this is not a new conversation. In fact, Francis Collins and the NIH went on record and planted their flag that this is a vitally important issue, and they're going to see to it that they will do everything that they can to help us essentially be better at what we already do. So I should say almost 2 years ago, Francis Collins and colleagues published an NIH article, and since then, the NIH has piloted several different programs to see what they might be able to implement in this space. So the one that you probably are most familiar with is the new BioSketch. So how many people enjoyed updating their BioSketch to the new format? That was super fun, right? So I think that was probably the start of this progression. The NIH intramurally has also implemented training modules related to experimental design. They've started in a few instances to explore ways to enhance the review process, which essentially employed checklists to assess analytic approach. They would have reviewers dedicated to understanding the scientific premise, and we'll go into that a little bit more in a minute. They've talked about how to explore unconscious bias in our proposals. And so I think that's a long way of saying some of these things probably got traction, other things probably they had to go back to the drawing board to figure out how they might be able to address them. But in all cases, it really is they're looking for ways, again, to help us essentially have the most rigorous science, to have to underscore the importance of experimental design. The last two things that they've been piloting include what they're calling a data discovery index, which is a potential place where we can go and find unpublished data. I'm not sure how much traction that's actually getting. Likewise, you might be aware that PubMed now has a new place where you can go. It's called PubMed Commons, and essentially that's where you can actually blog and provide comments about what you think about a given article. Again, I'm not sure that that's gotten a whole lot of traction, but it's something. So with that, you might have seen a couple of notices come down the pike. These two, titled Implementing Rigor and Transparency in NIH and AHRQ Research Grant and Career Development Applications, came out in early October. So as a sidebar, how do you guys find these or learn about these notices? Is this the first time you've seen them? So I don't know about you. I have the NIH's RSS feed as my homepage. So every time I open my browser, I see these kinds of things pop up. And most of the time they're completely irrelevant and I can ignore them, but then sometimes something like this comes out and it's actually good to be aware. So I say that only to emphasize that this was not the first time that this kind of concept had hit the NIH waves or notices out to our investigator base. In fact, back in June, they started giving us a heads up saying this is coming. In October, these were posted saying this is here, and this is at this point saying, and it's going into effect in January, so be ready. But
how much do you think of this is all due to the change we made several years ago at NIH, going from 25-page, very detailed, very methodologic proposals to these short newspaper articles that we write today? Is this just a consequence of administrative, that they were trying to save themselves money?
Sure. Now that's a very good question, and I don't know if I know the answer to that. Mm-hmm. They, through the assessment of their pilots, have said that it is absolutely possible to get the level of detail needed to convey scientific rigor in 12 pages. But I think that I
don't think that's true. NCAM had problems with people using dietary supplements. And the way they dealt with it was to wrote a proposal. If you got into the fundable range, then you were required to provide significant detail on what you were going to use. Had like 16 questions. And usually the write-up for that was longer than the grant.
I see. Okay.
And I went through with Hongi Zhang, we had the best score in the institute, and we had to go through this process 4 times before they were satisfied to let us go ahead and do the experiments.
Wow. Well, it's a very good point, and I'm not sure. Jim, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I just want to say I think that these requirements are a reaction to, recent, I don't want to say scandals, but issues raised with studies that are shown to be irreproducible.
Right.
And so they, they want to have a clearer understanding for the review committee so that there's at least a chance that when these things come out, when they eventually publish, people will be able to reproduce the studies. Also, with the clinicaltrials.gov reporting, the National Center for Biotechnology Information and CBI is finding that people are reporting their studies in very strange ways, reporting average of 25 hours of sleep per day, and just all kinds of odd things that they're putting in there. And it's very clear when you go back and look at the proposals that the proposals didn't clearly state things like what were the expected outcomes, what were the treatment groups, and all these things. How did they even slip past the peer review? It's not clear.
Yeah.
But they're now putting more of the onus on the investigators to write things that are going to be easier for the to ensure that these things are going to be well structured, and that NIH is spending its money wisely.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that insight. So I think that actually underscores why they're doing this in the first place. It really is to further enhance and increase scientific rigor. And this is not to suggest that all of you as investigators have not been scientifically rigorous to date or aren't doing these kinds of things in your applications already. The NIH is actually doing us a favor by kind of being a little bit more explicit on the kinds of things that they're looking for, and by extension, what the reviewers are going to be looking for. So this is actually a positive for all of us. So you might ask, what are the changes? The changes are essentially they've added some language into the guidelines for you as you prepare your application. They have added an additional attachment to the application that'll be pertinent, and we'll talk about that later. And then again, as I said, as a consequence, or not as a consequence, as a result, they've given us some insight as to the kinds of things reviewers are going to be looking for. So actually, I thought I would start there. So what are they looking for? What is the whole intent and goal? These are the changes in the review criteria. And as Dr. Kimberly mentioned, some of these will impact your score. And so helping the review group track and find this information in a very easy way is probably to your advantage. I'm not going to read through these. These slides will be posted on our website. In addition, there was a handout at the front door. If you didn't get it, you can, which gives links to the original notices so you can read through those and understand what award mechanisms are in play. So it's R01s, it's probably not S10s, which are shared instrumentation grants. So we'll have these, and then there's also a couple of additional references on the website that you can take a look at to understand further. So there are changes to the significance section to make sure that the scientific premise of the project is strong. There are changes that they'll be looking for in the approach section related to essentially the experimental design and the reagents you plan to use. And then finally, additional considerations, which are not scored but pertinent, relate again to the resources. Just out of respect for everyone's time, I'm just going to jump right in. So as you're thinking about writing your research strategy, again, for all of you targeting Feb 5 R01s or March 5 resubmissions, this is absolutely pertinent to you. So we've already talked, there are things that you as applicants need to be considering, things that reviewers will be looking for, and they probably fall into 4 major thrusts. The first being the scientific premise, second, authentication of key biological and chemical resources, consideration of relevant biological variables, and fourth, the rigorous experimental design. So some of you might ask, well, what is scientific premise? This is that part of your grant where you say, my colleagues, the previous authors, my research proposal stands on the shoulders of these observations in the literature, and I'm taking the next important step to show X. So one of the things that the NIH is asking for is essentially you characterizing the strength of that literature. If you're standing your proposal on the shoulders of a proposed or a previous work that was underpowered or biased, then that essentially deflates the strength of your work. And so they're looking, the NIH is looking for you to demonstrate that you are building on a rigorous set of observations previously, and it would make sense to fund you, basically. So that's what they mean by scientific premise. Again, you probably do this. It's probably a couple of additional sentences to explain why this was good work that you're basing your research on, whether it's yours or colleagues or competitors for that matter. It might also be an opportunity to say, this was a very important study that I read in the literature. It has a couple of weaknesses, and I will address those and take it well above and beyond in this proposal. So that's a win-win for the NIH. Moving on, the authentication of key biological or chemical resources. So this is essentially, you're using what you say you're using. Are the antibodies seeing the epitopes that you think that they're detecting? Are the cell lines you think that you're actually using? And so it's funny, the NIH has been kind of cute because they say they're not the ones to tell you how to authenticate this kind of stuff. That's up to you as the investigator. It's to you and your colleagues in your discipline to figure out how to authenticate various reagents and resources. Nevertheless, I would say at this point, the best effort to address that you've thought about this, you're taking it seriously, and you've done your level best to make sure that the cell lines, the mice, the various reagents and resources are what you think they are. There is no special form. If you go to the NIH's website and hunt everywhere, you're not going to find anything. This is just another piece of paper, essentially, where you half-inch margins all around, Arial 11 point, and you title it Authentication of Key Resources Plan. and you tell them what you think is true. I don't think that there's a page limit on this, but you PDF it and you upload it into the other attachments section of your application. That's how this form is going to work. And I suspect over the next couple of years, we'll get a little bit more traction in understanding what the NIH is really expecting in this domain. And as you attend national meetings, you and your colleagues will probably be able to really focus in on how to address this.
Antibodies and chemicals, a long time ago you'd make some of your own, et cetera, but nowadays most of the stuff is purchased.
Sure.
So why is it, if we're purchasing an antibody and it works in your laboratory, what else is necessary for to authentify this authentication of this? It's a purchased, chemical, as a purchased agent. So, what do they expect in that situation for us to go back and do everything that was done to actually determine the antibody was specific? I mean, that's supposed to be being done already.
Yeah, my hunch is that you can point to, this was an acquired resource from Fisher or whatever. I think that, and there's a Nature article in this regard. There's I think this stems largely from some concern that there was a lot of work based in cell lines, and then they went back and realized that the cell lines they thought they were reusing were absolutely not the case. And so it's in that regard that they really are trying to ensure, again, from a reproducibility standpoint, that the next investigator, they can go to Jack's lab and they can get the stuff they need. But if they can't, and they have to develop it or they have to borrow it from someone, it is what they think it is.
So the same would be true then for like animal strains, like mice strains.
I would estimate that's true.
Et cetera. But how about like, for instance, clinical reagents? Again, I think it would be very similar to what was said before. It seems to be much more of a standard, in terms of being purchased or.
I think there's far too much confidence in antibodies. What we're seeing is journals now are just trying to get away from antibodies. It used to be antibodies were so much more sensitive than other techniques, and that's no longer true. And so we've been running small molecule antibody reagents, and they're simply not measuring what they've touted, even though they're well documented by the manufacturer. The problem is sometimes with antibodies we'll recognize a protein on a gel, but they don't recognize the same protein in the tissue because the protein may not be in the same form. On a gel, it's denatured and stretched out, and the antibody is optimized for that, but it doesn't work with it. It can be transferred to tissue, and vice versa.
So what you're saying, is that the level of authentication is very specific to what you're proposing in your protocol. If you're saying you're using this antibody in tissue, then you have to show that it's actually being validated to be used in that.
Right. Okay. And so I think people are going to be too casual. This is what that guy at Amgen went through all this high quality work apparently in science, and only found that he could reproduce about 20% of the otherwise perfect work, which had gone through a carefully review. So that's what prompted NIH to realize that they had a real problem, and one that if members of Congress got to look at it who weren't so favorable on the money authorization for NIH, that NIH could really take it.
Sure.
And so we've been doing sloppy science, and I think the sloppy science goes back to this decision to put in very, very short proposals. It was more efficient, but it didn't allow reviewers to look carefully at what people were doing, and you were told, in fact, you were encouraged not to put methods in.
Right, and I think that was also observed in some of the publications, some of the journals, and I think that they're now stepping away from those limitations again to make sure that investigators have a little bit more breathing room to demonstrate.
Even a scientific premise is based in background, which is no longer there, and it gets folded a little bit into your significance.
Yeah.
So did you have a question?
Is this notice embedded in the current parent R01 RFA? Can we find this?
So my hunch is, the notices usually are in the current RFAs, and then the language related to the significance section is embedded in the RFAs that you'll be seeing. I don't know if they've gone back, for example, to the parent R01 and actually embedded the content, or they just list the notices, but they're pretty good about listing them.
Jennifer, I
Sure.
don't want to undercut people's seriousness about the scientific issues, but I know at least in some of the discussions that people are concerned about just reagents having been described well enough that somebody else could actually get the same reagent to repeat the work, because anti-CD4 antibody there's hundreds of them and they're not all the same. And so you need to describe things well enough that they can be clearly identified as well.
Right, thank you very much. I think that's exactly right. So beyond reagents, I think that the NIH is also strongly encouraging us to take special consideration of other biologic variables. And so this is, for example, age, young versus not as young, male versus female. And beyond that, if your work really does need to focus in on a single group, so if it's relevant to females only, you have to strongly justify why you're looking at females only, whether they're mice or otherwise. And so this is the opportunity to, in your approach section, comment explicitly on why you have designed your study the way that you have. And then, so this all leads to rigorous experimental design. And at this point, I'd like to invite my colleague, David Redden, to comment on design.
So I'm going to echo exactly what Jennifer was stating. I want to emphasize the majority of what I've heard and listened to and read through over the past several months with regard to rigorous design. I actually believe what they're asking us to do is to go on and document further what we have been doing and give it to them in far greater detail. So when we're talking about the rigor, this all comes back up, and you'll see a lot of these things we already do when we put in applications with regard to careful sample size estimation, the statistical methods plan. Always, my favorite question that I always get, how are you going to deal with missing data, which is always a complex issue. So all of these things we're typically doing in the establishment and the design of R01s, but what they're asking us to do is to be much more specific in our articulation of exactly how we're going to do it. And going back, because there's very rarely in a clinical trial that I will not say I'm going to directly adjust for sex. However, in animal studies, as they pointed out when I was looking at all the NIH information, you know what? A lot of times I don't say that in an analysis plan when I'm talking about the animals. And that's what they're getting to when they say accounting for biological variables. And they're emphasizing the need to think about it across the whole spectrum and to get that level of rigor across it all. If you look at all these things are typically the things that we addressed in statistical methods. However, and I've discussed with colleagues before, for all the grants that will be going in January and February, and also the resubmissions in March, usually I pass to collaborators through the BERD and through the work in the Biostats department. We always help in the design of the specific aims. We pass sample size calculations, data management plans, all that to demonstrate the rigor. But we're going to now have to add one more paragraph that is specifically addressing how will we archive the information, make it transparent, make it available. And so getting ready to start writing those paragraphs and assisting colleagues in having that ready for their applications. Now, I'm going to be very blunt and very transparent. Very good review article, if you want to go look at it, is in Nature. I think it was published October the 15th. In fact, I know it was because that's my mother's birthday, and that's how I remember it. And they were not very kind to my field. I'll be very blunt. They were not very kind to the statisticians. But everything that they said has an anchor of truth to it. And there's all of these things that come up in research that we're all constantly battling. And they're in our nature because we want to do good research. We want it to be published. And the points that were made, and these are the things that are being emphasized and trying to avoid, is this hypothesis myopia, where, you're actually so ingrained in your hypothesis, are you actually collecting data in a manner that biases you toward it? And how will we write a section to say we're not going, how we're going to prevent that? I smile because the Texas sharpshooter problem is a problem that every graduate student in statistics has, because often we will ask, is there a pattern in the data? And they'll immediately start studying, and they'll come up with something when there's nothing there. And how do we go about avoiding that? And we go about avoiding that in a sense by implementing certain things such as blinding, the standard stuff that we often do with data safety monitoring boards. We have and this is also, I can testify to this from personal experience, asymmetric attention. If I go into a collaboration and I walk in and I put down and I say, I've proven the hypotheses that you set out to, everybody celebrates and there are very few questions. However, if I come in and say I can't find it, then the questions start coming in with regard to, well, was there an outlier? Or were you certain that you didn't reverse the groups by accident? And all the questions come up. So the issue becomes not to be too quick to actually not check your assumptions when you have found the results that you were hoping for. And to be able to show in transparency how you've gone through checking all of the things and all the assumptions that hide behind the conclusions and detailing it. And this is also something that's in stats books everywhere, the just so storytelling. There's actually a great textbook in statistics that slams factor analysis, which is a multivariate technique where you come in and it's a psychology approach. I don't mean to offend anybody, but the last question is, the last comment in the book on that chapter is that if you can interpret the results, then you've got something. That's not the way it's supposed to go. You don't make up a study based on your interpretations. So how do we avoid it? How do we go about this? It's really questioning, is that what I was bringing up to you before? Whether it's significant or not, play the devil's advocate. And we'll have to write sections on how we will do that. And we've already done the pre-commitment. In every grant application, we actually write out the analysis plan to the best of our ability. Now, can we change it? Yes, we have to, based upon the nature of the data. However, it has to be justified. And it has to be justified very clearly and appropriately based on statistics and justification for that. One of the things that was highly recommended by nature is to do the team of rivals. In other words, to have someone else look at your results, to collaborate with you, someone that would require extreme convincing of it, and that would increase the rigor of what you were doing. And we do this a lot. I mean, and I do my best to maintain this. Blind data analysis is very, very important. In other words, when you are collecting data or you're asking someone to, or you're conducting your own research, if you can have it collected in a manner that avoids you from knowing exactly which group is which, then that would increase. Now, if you can't do that, then bottom line is you need to probably pass it to someone, a colleague, who can do that analysis and pass it to them in a blinded fashion such that it will increase the validity of the conclusions to state it was done under a blinded approach. So let's go through some of the things that we typically do. I want to emphasize this. Almost all of these things are actually being done here already. I know this. The last slide will indicate the thing, and we just need to be more careful in documenting and writing this up and emphasizing that we are writing it in response. The thing is, every time that we do a substantial iteration of your data, you've got to be able to keep the history. One of the things that I've always enjoyed or I've found amusing is when we talk about the velocity of data, that data is changing over time. We need to be able to show how the data has evolved, how it's been collected, And it's essentially version control of the database. That way, if someone says, well, I want to see the data at this stage, that's available and can be produced. One of the things that I always recommend, especially, and this happens for most very large, rigorous clinical trials, and it's interesting because it should be also done for smaller studies, is actually double data entry. In the sense that for a small study, one mistake in a field can skew everything and make people extremely optimistic, and it could be very hard to identify. Whereas if you have the data entered twice, it's very easy for a statistician or a methodologist to use a computer to say, go field by field and identify anywhere that there's a discrepancy to increase the validity and the transparency that the data has been entered accurately. And it allows a very quick identification of transcription errors. So I would also recommend, I know a lot of individuals do their own analyses, and I do not want to shut that down. I don't believe that's necessarily a bad thing, but replication, reproducibility is a good thing. And one of the things that is slammed a lot in statistics is what is called a graphical user interface, or a GUI, where it is a point and click. So you can come through and you can ask for a regression and you click the variables you want in. The only problem with that is once you close the program, there's no history. And you have to remember it. If you're doing that, remember there are techniques where you can make the graphical user interface record the actual script so it could be reproduced, or work with the methodologist in a way that the program can be archived, which is extremely important, because at the end of the day, that's what, when there's a large number of statistical textbooks out now that lead with the word reproducible statistical research. And they're all over the place, and what they're getting to is that they want to see the decisions that were made as an analytic ready data set was being produced. How was the data manipulated? How was missing data addressed? How much missing data is there? Was it imputed? Under what conditions was it imputed? All these details fall in statistical programs. And what people are wanting to see is, can you produce the program that produced that p-value? Can you produce the data set that produced that p-value? The thing about it, though, is, again, graphical user interfaces often lead you in a situation where there's a clear lack of transparency and documentation.
So should we go back to the command line?
No.
Why not?
Well, there are, you can think about things such as R, such as SAS. You can still do command line, but just like I just said a minute ago, SPSS, Stata, SAS, all of them have a graphical user interface, but it's imperative that you set it up as you're working the system. It's writing the code in the background, and as you exit it, it saves it and archives it. So that it's there on the very next time, you can pull it straight back up and reproduce it. But it has to be archived. That's the key, is that there has to be some form of scripting going on, as you said, the command line.
Nalay Basu recommended a book by Vince Buffalo that perhaps should be read by a lot of people, that really goes into this in a lot of detail about all the steps, all the databases you referred to, step by step by step. He was a grad student who wrote a book after he finished his training, which was really written in terms that everybody could.
Well, we're going to get to that in just a minute. Like I was saying, with regard to SAS and R and other leading statistical packages that are there to help define as well as analysis, there's more and more of that coming online of how to archive every step. Yes?
Our packages are out there, and sometimes it's not clear how well they're validated. Do you think that certain ones should be perhaps submitted to some sort of validation before used in an experimental setting?
Well, you see, that's an interesting question, and this is just about how often anal I can be when I'm always a little nervous when we're going toward publication. And I'm going to get there in just a minute. I not only run it within SAS, if I've seen something run in R and I know all the variables, I will take the R data frame, move it into SAS, run it again, and they better agree. So there is this validation across domains, replication across domains. Also, this is a key thing, and I'm going to throw myself under the bus at this point. There's nothing worse than getting a call about a Cochrane review that says, hey, we got a paper that you published 5 years ago. Can we see the data set? And I've had that happen. And fortunately, in collaboration with individuals, we had set up the archive. I could go directly to the folder that had the final, that had the raw data set, the program that took the raw data set to produce an analysis-ready data set, stored the analysis-ready data set, the program that read the analysis-ready data set to produce the outcome. All of it, de-identified, could be passed directly to them to allow them to run it themselves and question any decisions that we had made in the manipulation of that data. But it's imperative that it has to be archived. And in fact, going to R and going back to SAS and all the different statistical methods, they are actually evolving the software rapidly to assist in reproducibility. I'll tell you about that in just a minute. I'm going to say this also. If you conducted your own analysis, a wise approach, and this happens every day, is to pass a blinded data set to a methodologist. Somebody will say, here, David, I would like you to take a shot. Here's what I've done, but here's the blinded set. I would like to know how you would have approached this analysis. Are you going to make the same judgments about the nature of the data, about the nature of the design, about how to adjust for certain factors? Are you going to come to the same type of conclusion? And if we differ, how are we different? Why are we different? Even if you can't get a blinded data set to someone, it's not uncommon. It happens every day. I'll get either a phone call or a knock on the door that says, hey, do you mind if I sit down and ask you to look at what I've done? Did I miss something? Yes.
I was just going to say, we're pretty good friends, so I know how to find a biostatistician. For those of you who aren't good friends with a biostatistician, how do you find them?
Research Commons.
Okay. Well, yeah, so Research Commons can connect you to the BERD,
the BERD,
Biostats,
the Biostats, Genealogy and Research Design Group within the CCTS, and we will assist in all of these things. And if you need assistance with regard to writing that reproducibility paragraph, we will be more than happy to step up and assist you with that. But also, just ask the basic questions. Go to a colleague. Did I miss something? Do you think, would you have done it this way? Better yet, or is there another analysis you would do? Honestly, a lot of you know that I'm very good friends with Andy Westfall. Andy and I will sit down many times and just say, all right, what other analysis? How can we be more confident that this is ready for publication? Are there other techniques? Are there other robust methods? And to talk about how we would seek to find agreement across multiple approaches in doing the analysis.
I have a question.
Sure.
I come from the sort of the basic science, chemical, biochemical side. A lot of these issues seem to be much more clinically related. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that, but as I was listening to Dr. Croker, I was standing over there actually with thinking, if someone came to me, how would I assist them in designing some form of validation of their biologic agent? What things would we do? So I would answer that to yes, almost all. A lot of this is coming from the clinical side, but I think there is a desire to have it established further in other domains. And I think it's interesting as I've studied this, there's a lot of, hey, what we've been doing in clinical research might also be needed to be addressed also in animal research. Go.
Yeah, so the other issue that I have is, when we were talking many slides ago about the strong scientific premise, actually saying, okay, these guys did it this way, and I'm going to now take it the other way. I've been on NIH study sections, and that proposal will get sunk for innovation, right? It'll get a really poor innovation score. If you say, I'm just going to take what he did, and I'm going to turn the crank a little bit more, and I'm going to do it a little bit better. So there seems to be a really fine line between this. Maybe you can address.
No, I think your point about the fact that we can't just be incremental, that we really do have to pay special attention to the innovation. I think you're spot on. I do think that there is probably room to make sure that the premise, the underlying observations on which you plan to base your entire study are themselves solid, if you will. And so you can probably have both.
So how does one do that? I mean, if you're citing published literature that presumably has gone through a rigorous review process, then how do we verify whether it's sound or not as people who weren't involved in that review process?
That's one way is the inclusion-exclusion criteria. For example, I work a lot with people with dementia, and I went through 30 years of research and found that people who had dementia have been systematically excluded from this protocol. And even if they included people with dementia, they excluded people who were, quote, uncooperative. That was my entire sample. So sometimes when you look at the research, you will find repetitive omissions or exclusions that made sense at the time, but over a time period, you now have a whole subpopulation of individuals who've systematically been excluded from an important research activity.
So does that mean those papers are not valid, or
No.
they're just not valid for
It just means
background on study on
it means
dementia?
that there's a population that has been excluded. That's one way.
I would use the word they're not generalizable.
There you go.
That would be my immediate reaction. Is if when you look at inclusion-exclusion criteria, they help you understand the generalizability of the findings, and we have to be very careful not to generalize beyond the inclusion-exclusion criteria. Yes, sir.
But I think the comment that was made in the back is absolutely true. There was a time when it wasn't as difficult to get funding, where you would often replicate at least part of somebody else's work to ensure that it worked that way before you moved on. Now, A, you cannot get that published anywhere, and B, I mean, it's so difficult on the innovation scale. You can't write that in a grant. You might want to do it in your laboratory, but if you write it in a grant, you're going to get creamed for not being innovative, for not really moving forward. And I think Steve was mentioning before, when you had 25 pages to describe this, you had a chance to be able to discuss this a little bit better. But now you really don't have the space to do that. You can't put in anywhere near as much data within the grant to prove a point that, say, something in the literature is wrong. It's very hard to show that in a 12-page where how many figures are you going to put in to show something is wrong, and then you have to put in preliminary data to say which way you're going. I mean, it's very difficult to do that. So I think NIH, in a way, has set it up for it to be very difficult to reproduce other people's work, because we can't spend the time or the money to do that. We can't get the money to do that because then it's not innovative.
I agree with that. I'm going to put one spin on it, and I'm going to not throw it out there, but welcome feedback on it. I agree that if you come in and you put that under your innovation, you'll be slaughtered. I've been in study section also, and I think that would be it. But under the new mandate, they are opening a door for us, in a sense, to be able to say under the reproducibility piece, that before we proceed we need to be able to do these specific things. So I think there's a door open for us to walk through, but we have to thread that needle. I really do. And the last piece here is...
Doesn't that have to fall under your preliminary results, though? That you can reproduce those things? Because if you can't reproduce those things, then your entire grant falls apart.
It's an excellent point.
So, one way to think about that is to use that to your advantage and make the claim that this satisfies the reproducibility.
Our preliminary results.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, you're not giving us enough room to do all of this stuff, so you have to think about the way you can convince them that you've thought of it.
Yeah. But I moved to hit on reviews where I have a data set that's very small that we found, and part of an aim is just to increase the size of the data set, and I've gotten that criticized. But that's not really very, very, innovative or intriguing, whatever. You should just be moving on. So I just, you get hit sometimes on these reviews that make it kind of difficult to know how to proceed.
Next time you get that question, please call, that comment, please call me. I'll help you with that one, because we can discuss that through conditional power.
Okay.
All right?
So the other types of variables, and someone was asking about, well, does it apply to a basic scientist? I was called in by Tank Grubbs about a year ago because ARP decided to change the form of one of the diets that's typically used for animal experiments. He was doing contract work for the NCI to try and stop breast cancer. And the new diet that ARP generated caused a 40% reduction in breast cancer. So fascinating. So what was it caused by? They irradiated the diet. So this is a variable that you could get caught with. When you buy a diet, it's like buying an antibody and assuming it works. You buy a diet, the diet is the biggest modulator of the microbiome. And the microbiome, as we now know, is a very big factor in a lot of diseases. So if you start changing the microbiome, your experimental model is just going to change all over the place. And I think the bedding is another area of concern, because the bedding is actually full of lignans, polymers, and the polymers, when they're degraded in the microbiome, become steroid-like molecules. So if somebody changed the bedding on you, your whole experiment would change.
But that's something, Steve, in the grant application you can point to. You are aware of these variables, and they will be held constant. Of course, then you got to go work with ARP, so they are constant.
Yeah.
But I think that's part of what's behind this initiative from the NIH. There are always going to be variables we don't know, but there clearly are some we do know, and we often pay attention to those. And I think they're saying, come on, guys, we got to do a better job. And you just pointed out two that are very important for animal studies, and there are lots of stories about different colonies in different institutions that have different phenotypes, and now it's probably pretty clear why. Although we may not know the specific, it's a combination of the environment defined by diet and bedding, and who else is in the room along with them. I think one of the key things is there are always strategic issues in presenting a grant, and how one describes the literature. Hopefully we all do it fairly, but that's always going to be open to the judgment of the study section. I think a critical point this evening was to help make us all aware that some of these issues are now going to be specifically assessed. Even though we've only got 12 pages, we may have, figure 11 may have to go. And there may be a paragraph on this, but it's going to be scored. And there are ways in which we can deal with it, because I hope explicitly, but at least implicitly, we've been dealing with these issues mostly, is now just making it more clear. And then as we clarify it, improving things, because there's always room for improvement.
And that's key to this last slide, is that with regard to almost all the statistical packages, for the sake of reproducibility, they have modified it, and there are now documents, or specifically programs, that are merging both the text editor and the statistical software, such that as you execute and compile the manuscript, you can build a document that actually embeds the statistical program into the manuscript, and as soon as something is executed that would generate statistics or figures or anything, it shows both the code and immediately weaves that information and those figures behind the code. This is getting to be very popular, and a lot of manuscripts are coming out and techniques coming out published using the R system as well as SAS. And with that, that is the end of our discussion, and we can open it up for further questions.
I have a question. So for those of us in the HIV field, there's a line coming up January 7th, so it's right in the future. Would it be advisable to kind of already think about this and put it in now, given that, you know, you may go through a revision, you already have it in there, or what's your approach or your advice?
I would probably advise being sensitive to the new expectations. I welcome input from others in the room, but I probably anticipate the way.
I would try to be ahead of curve, and I think that's when we go to write the reproducibility paragraphs, at least with the plan with regard to the BERD and the biostats groups on campus, is to go on and start discussing and talking about having archive techniques, using these weave techniques such as, and just putting them there, because I think you would go back to say, okay, they are trying to be innovative, or at least on the outer curve with regard to reproducibility and transparency, because that's supposed to be a very transparent document, or at least that is the most transparent of documents.
So it sounds like intuition will be no longer a facet of good scientific knowledge.
Well, Steve, intuition will always be important, but you know, even now, you don't write a grant saying, I think this would be a good idea. You frame it differently. The plan will be the same. The driving intuition will always be there. We just need to be sensitive to the way to how to communicate effectively.
We can't reveal intuition during the review process.
You frame it in the appropriate way.
Right.
That's called grantsmanship. But what we don't want to do is get tripped up by some of these things, because NIH is taking it very seriously. And that's the way it's going to be.
I have some questions from the reviewer perspective. Are they likely to hire more statisticians to be on the committees to address this issue?
Most of the study sections I sit on right now already maintain a panel of biostatisticians
Well,
there.
I know, but I think you need more for this.
It would make sense, but that's going to be up to CSR.
And the
Figure it
second
out.
question is going back to the scientific basis. For reviewers, are they likely to be tasked with checking the scientific basis in terms of the rigor of the studies that are supporting it?
So in the pilot that the NIH performed, they, I think, did exactly that. They went into the study section and said, your job is to check the facts, check the background. And they were responsible for saying this scientific premise for this one is fantastic, this one is underpowered and probably not ideal. So I can't say how they're going to roll this out officially, but that's been.
Because again, I think that affects how seriously the reviewers are going to take it. Because they have to hunt up all the original studies and check the rigor of them that were supporting it.
So as you know, part of the premise of a study section is that there's a panel of experts, where that panel of experts may know that already. Now, of course, there's a little bit of a disconnect there, but that's the operative premise. And I don't think there's ever going to be a circumstance where the panel is told, no, you don't have to know the science, just give us a score. There's always going to be the premise that is incumbent upon the review group to know and evaluate the a priori science as well as the proposed application. I think what you're saying is the dial may be turned up a little bit for the expectations on the review panel. And it'll take them probably a little bit of time. But if I were writing a grant for February 1st, and I'll probably only be doing 2, I am not going to assume that the study section is not going to pay attention to this. I am going to assume that they are. And help them as much as I can, both interpreting the literature and framing the question, and then making sure that the methodology is cogently and compellingly presented.
Do you know if they have any annotated sections, particularly like on the authentication of the key resources plan? Any, they have that in like the Ks and occasional Rs where they've got some annotated sections.
I haven't seen any examples yet. I've seen some
It seems like it could be exhaustive. I mean, you do a study that has 20 different monoclonal antibodies conjugated to various fluorochromes. Are you really going to write each of those up? All these different reagents, and we've kind of talked a little bit about it. You bought it from a reliable resource, and you've used it before, and maybe it's in your preliminary studies, and maybe that's enough, but not every reagent you've already used. And so I'm just wondering if they might do that to help out.
Authentication, does that happen within 12 pages?
No, it sounds like it's separate.
So is that a way to actually get more space to write about?
I mean, it probably is, but I'm just saying it still could also be that if you're going to be exhaustive, that could be.
I'm just pointing out for the reagents that you make yourself, which are often the most innovative, maybe more space.
Yes.
So obviously we're thinking about how do we use that in a way that won't offend the study section. We've got another 6 pages, but that might.
Awesome reagent.
Yeah, that might be a way to think about it.
But this is actually, also when we think about core facilities here at UAB, and some of them actually were using some of those reagents, that we're using. Would that be something by the core facilities that could also be provided? Some of these kind of, paragraphs saying like, how these reagents are authenticated, for, to be used in the grant, basically. I think that would be a service, that would be very useful to the scientific community when it's actually, because then not everybody has to reproduce it over and over again.
Could I flip it then a little bit and ask for you to, in an email, to research comments?
Yep, CCTS.
CCTS. What are the cores from which you would be interested in having that kind of information?
Me personally, probably not, because I'm not a basic scientist, but I can kind of send the email to initiate it if you want to.
But that would be very helpful, because then what we can do is we can go to the core director and say, hey, this is coming. And there were a whole bunch of people here. By the way, it was beyond standing room only, because we were out in the hallway where there was nothing to do but to drink beer. But there was a whole group of people here tonight, and this is important for them. Important for us as a community. That would be huge.
I'll do that.
So when we first started mass spec back in the mid-90s, we went through all the peptides that were being generated here on campus, and we found 80% of them were not what they claimed to be. A lot of them still either were missing an amino acid or still had a covering group on them, and sometimes they were just totally different. And we were told by the people who made them that they're a single peak by HPLC. How could you possibly say they're wrong? Well, then eventually the new standard was that every peptide was checked by mass spec. In the antibody field, we say it's a single band on a gel. That's the same illogical statement, that because it's a single band on a gel that's around about the right molecular weight doesn't do the damn thing. And so we just have to raise the standard to get the quality of research that NIH is wanting, and in fact the rest of us want.
But then I think you're asking a lot, especially when you think about junior investigators, who may not have a lot of budget.
The core facilities can do that. I meant it in that context.
And they can, yes, and they should. I agree with you. But as an investigator, I don't think a young basic scientist we'll be able to, question, and have the same resources to check on every, peptide or every monoclonal antibody and make sure that what they're saying
And
is
not even the most senior, because then you're talking about a section of authentication that's there. But there are going to be some key reagents where, especially many times, grant applications have locally developed reagents where it might be particularly important, and some of the other validation authentication is going to have to refer to literature. And we cannot, and we shouldn't think we have to solve all of this all at once in just one single way in 5 years.
And actually, it points to another question I had. It's, a lot of what, David, what you referred to, I think, it's very well taken, and I think, probably should be part of everything. But I think it takes also, if we're really serious about it, which I agree we should, it takes a lot of money. And a lot of times, we're selling ourselves short, on these efforts, that will take us to the double data entry, to have that research person to go to somebody and say, like, can you check this for me and run it again, just as we ran it, and people are not going to do that in their free time and saying, like, yeah, I don't have anything to do tonight, and I'm going to do this for you. So in a way, you have to actually put it into your grant to be serious about it and that you're going to be doing this really. That's a lot of money, especially when you talk about smaller grants, and not so much, R1s, but, I'm applying for an R34 right now, R31s, R3, any of those.
But we have been asked to do that by the NIH.
Well, I hope we're not. I think it's, again, this fine line, to really be able to show something that is scientifically interesting and.
But this may be something the institution has to face. That if you want to have a high quality research base at UAB that you can go out and brag about, the institution may have to put some resources into this to make it happen. And an example of where this happened and it was done was when a new standard of animal care was brought in the early 1990s. And it raised the cost of animal care by about twofold. So everybody who had big animal studies obviously were heavily hit. And so what they did was to actually institutionally keep the cost down and raise it 25% a year until it reached the real cost. And so there was an institutional investment there that prevented the loss of research. But it wasn't an ongoing thing. It was something that was there in the short term and the scale back.
So in terms of institutional support, I would point out, though Dick was here at the beginning of the meeting, he was sitting in the back and he's not here now. So I understand the petition, but the petitioner should send those emails to Dick.
Well, we need your support.
So he can,
we need your endorsement.
I will send him more than one, I promise you. But I do take those points. Obviously, there's going to be a judgment point. I think the first issue is to make sure that we all recognize this is serious business. Can we make it perfect all at once? Probably not. But I don't think that's going to be the bar for Feb 1 kind of submissions. At least Feb 1 60. Who knows what's going to happen after that? But it would be a shame not to be successful in Feb 1 16 submissions because we were unaware of this initiative. And I think that's really the point of this evening, is to make us aware of this initiative so we can do the best possible job we can within what's available to us.
And to use the resources that we have, or to point out with regard to if you needed a letter of support to say, hey, I need someone to be able to verify that this is reproducibly from an experimental design perspective or a methodology perspective. The BERD has office hours and we have clinics, and these are the types of things that can be easily addressed within that framework. And we can cite that in the application, and we can supply a letter that says we would be available to do that.
So it's a little bit after 6. There's still a little bit here in the back room, but we want to thank everyone for being here this evening. Please don't hesitate to talk about this evening to your colleagues. because this is really important. And we might actually think about doing this again pretty quickly. Because though we had seriously a very large group, had over 60 people here this evening, we still have only touched a fraction of the UAB community and the community of our partner networks as well. So thanks again, guys. I appreciate your time.
Did you do your 5K?
I will. So in regards to this.
Yeah.
No. It's a point and click. It's so.
But let me sit down. I've got prison.
Okay.
Thank you.
I learned SAS.
SAS. Well,
We look forward to video.
Yep. Or the digital recording.
All right, take care.
Yeah, now I feel like. Oh, yeah, right, right after that.
no,